Between the 15th and 18th centuries, up to 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft, 80% of them women. Witchcraft was blamed for disease, death, disaster, anything that went wrong. And to find witches, they created brutal, twisted tests. But how did they actually decide who lived and who burned? That's what we're uncovering today, and at the end, I'll reveal the last person ever executed for witchcraft. Number 1. The swimming test, aka witch dunking. One of the most infamous methods of witch detection was the swimming test, often called witch dunking. The logic was definitely twisted, but it sort of made sense. Water is pure, so it would reject evil. But when you think of this dunking test, we usually imagine a cruel test. If you float, you're guilty, and if you sink, you're free to go. But that's actually thanks to exaggerated Victorian-era storytelling, and they loved their dramatic horror tales back then. In reality, during the height of the European witch trials, the swimming test didn't leave the accused to drown without a chance. The suspect was usually strapped into a chair or bound and lowered into the water using a rope and pulley system. If they seemed to float, they were guilty, and if they started to drown, they'd often be pulled out just in time and declared innocent. The real danger was not from the water, but from the bias of the crowd. You see, most people don't simply sink or float, they just bob awkwardly in the middle. And whether you were seen as floating suspiciously or sinking heroically often came down to the neighborhood gossip or who secretly hated you. Sheesh, and people think social media hate posts are bad. Number 2. The pricking test. If floating didn't get you, sharp objects might. The pricking test was another popular method used to prove someone was a witch in 16th and 17th century England. The idea behind it was that witches supposedly had a devil's mark somewhere on their body, a spot that wouldn't bleed or feel pain. So, witch hunters would literally stab you with needles, pins, or special bodkins, looking for this numb spot. Well, as much as I hate a simple shot, I can already tell you I'm not surviving this test. Now, you might think, how often could that possibly work? Well, when the professional witch finder was being paid per witch, quite often. And some unscrupulous finders would even use retractable or blunt needles to fake the results. Anything for a profit to these people, I guess. In fact, this occupation was often well paid, so many took it up and made money. And if you thought this was just a couple pinpricks, these tests could go on for hours, with the accused being poked head to toe while being stripped in front of a crowd. And if someone was unfortunate enough to have a mole, birthmark, or even an ingrown hair, that could be all it took to find them guilty. And if no mark was found, they would just use another method, which brings us to the next obsession. Number 3. Finding the devil's mark. After all that pricking, you'd think they'd finally stop. But nope, finding the devil's mark was its own horrifying step. Witches were believed to have a special mark, gifted, apparently, by the devil himself. This could be anything from a mole, wart, or freckle to a skin tag or even a scar. Basically, if your skin wasn't magazine smooth, you could be in trouble. Thank God we know about skin conditions today, huh? Accusers would strip suspects and examine them, sometimes shave them, looking for unnatural blemishes. And since medicine wasn't exactly advanced, even something like eczema or a birthmark could seal your fate. Any mark that didn't hurt when poked was labeled a witch's teat, where it was believed the devil or his familiars would feed. Alright, and if they did find something questionable, that just might land you in the torture chamber, where a confession was only a few screams away. Number 4. Confession under torture. Ah yes, the good old torture chamber. Pain is powerful, and the medieval folks knew how to get the answer they wanted. Plainly and simply, they would get the truth out of you by beating and torturing you. Authorities believed that witches wouldn't confess unless they were forced, so they made sure the accused felt more than enough, motivation. One tragic case was Agnes Sampson of Scotland in 1591. She was accused of witchcraft during the North Berwick witch trials. To get her to confess, they shaved off all her hair and used a device called the witch's bridle, a metal gag with spikes to silence her. After days of this brutal torture, she finally gave in and admitted to things like calling up storms to sink the king's ship. All of this was nonsense, of course, but her confession resulted in her execution in Edinburgh. Number 5. Owning a black cat, or any familiar. You've seen it in just about every Halloween cartoon. The witch in a pointy hat riding her broomstick with a black cat by her side. It is such a classic image. While this may be a bit of Halloween fare in today's world, the link between witches and black cats goes back hundreds of years, showing up in woodcuts, pamphlets, and illustrations as far back as the 15th century. Back then, people genuinely believed witches had familiars, supernatural helpers that could take the shape of animals. Animals like black cats, toads, rats, and owls were in that category. But black cats got the worst of it. No, not because they did anything wrong, but because they were mysterious, independent, and, thanks to Christian symbolism, associated with the devil. If you had one lingering around your house or one stared at you for a bit too long, it raised suspicion. In 1579, a woman named Agnes Waterhouse was one of the first women to be hanged in England, partly because she supposedly sent her demonic cat named Satan to harm people. Well, if she actually named that cat Satan in those times, not a great call. Enjoying the weirdness so far? Well, there's more ahead in the video, so make sure you hit that like button and subscribe for more interesting videos. Tell me, do you fear a black cat crossing your path? Let's see what people think in the comments. Now, let's see how strange-looking eyes were problematic too. Number 6. Weird eyes or unblinking gaze. So let's say you didn't have a cat named Satan, but your eyes looked off. Maybe they were different colors. Maybe you caught someone's eye for too long. But that was enough to make people fearful. In medieval Europe, a long, unblinking gaze wasn't just awkward, it was considered dangerous. People believed that witches could curse you just by looking at you the wrong way. And things like heterochromia, where the person has two different colored eyes, or even just naturally intense eye contact, could be seen as a sign of dark magic. In a time where people feared the unknown, anything that stood out physically felt unnatural, and unnatural meant unholy. Not gonna lie though, I kinda wish I had a red and a blue eye. Anybody else, or am I just freaking weird? Number 7. Speaking in tongues or muttering. So picture this, you've already got eyes people call devilish, and then you're caught quietly talking to yourself. Maybe you're praying under your breath, or just grumbling about never-ending chores. Haven't we all? But back in those times, people didn't have their eyes glued to their devices like you do right now. They were looking at other people, and if someone caught you muttering to yourself, they would think you are seeing someone they can't see. Maybe you're casting spells or evil incantations, and before long, you'd be accused of witchcraft. People thought this was a way to communicate with demons. Latin, for example, if you weren't clergy and knew a few phrases, people might assume you were conjuring something sinister. And God forbid you happen to be muttering to yourself and then bad weather occurs. At that point, you were guaranteed to be considered a witch. Which conveniently brings us to our next category. Number 8. Weather manipulation. If your village had a bad storm, ruined crops, or sudden floods, guess who got blamed? No, not nature, you. Weather manipulation was a classic accusation during witch trials. People believed that witches could summon lightning, hail, or droughts just by casting a spell, or worse, by simply being nearby. Kind of funny how modern media now consider stuff like that to be cool. But in 1562, Agnes Waterhouse, yep, the same woman with the demonic cat, was also accused of causing a storm that killed livestock. Her crime was allegedly boiling a pot and muttering. And it wasn't just bad luck. While weather today might be considered an annoyance depending on the particular instance, back then it affected survival, so if your neighbor didn't like you, it was easy to say that you were the one who called the rain. Number 9. Unusual behavior after loss. Today we know grief isn't one size fits all, but in the Middle Ages it kind of had to be. If you lost a loved one and didn't cry enough, or cried too much, or just acted odd, people got suspicious. In tight-knit villages where everyone watched each other, emotional behavior was a norm. Deviate from it, and the rumors spread. Some thought witches fed off of death or were too cold because they had no soul. A woman in Salem, Sarah Osborne, was partially accused because she didn't attend her husband's funeral properly. People saw her behavior as off, and that helped seal her fate. So whether you were numb from grief or just didn't perform the right social rituals, it could be twisted into evidence of being a witch. Number 10. Healing without a priest. Let's say you're trying to cope with a loss by helping others. Maybe you know some herbal remedies passed down from your grandmother. But alas, even helping someone feel better didn't quite sit right with those medieval folks. If you healed someone without a priest's blessing, it raised major red flags. The church claimed healing was God's domain, and any miracle outside their authority was suspicious or even satanic. Midwives, herbalists, and folk heroes, many of them women, were easy targets. Just having dried herbs in your home could be used as proof of witchcraft. One such woman, Bess Clark, in 1596, helped cure a fever with a homemade salve. She was later accused of stealing the illnesses and sent to trial. Talk about backwards. Number 11. Isolation or being too quiet. If you tend to keep to yourself, didn't gossip, or were just generally an introvert, you weren't seen as peaceful. You became suspicious. Medieval villagers expected you to be social, and too much isolation meant you were hiding something. Many accused witches were simply introverts or loners, and in a world where being different was dangerous, silence really could get you killed. And finally, number 12. Being accused. Yeah, that's it. And you know what? In many cases, they didn't even look for or consider any evidence. If someone pointed a finger at a person they didn't like, they could easily be put on trial. Jealousy, grudges, land disputes, it all got weaponized. Once accused, proving innocence was nearly impossible. It wasn't about the truth. It was about surviving a system rigged from the start. Jesus, just imagine if these people had access to social media. Thankfully, the belief in witchcraft slowly declined due to Enlightenment thinking, scientific progress, legal reforms, and changing social attitudes. And to answer the question, who was the last unfortunate soul to be accused of witchcraft in Europe? Anna Goldie, a Swiss housemaid, was accused of putting needles in her employer's daughter's milk and bread. The girl got sick and started spitting pins, and so her employer said it was witchcraft. She managed to escape at first, but was then captured and tortured to confess that she had made a pact with the devil. And that was the end of her life. Goldie was one of the ones to be beheaded in 1782 due to witchcraft. So tell me, which of these bizarre facts do you think is the craziest? Let's hear it in the comments below. Now check out this video on screen, and thanks for watching this one. We'll see you next time.